How Good is Good Enough, Chapter 7, Liar, Liar. Perhaps the most emotionally perplexing problem with the good people go to heaven view is that it contradicts the teachings of Jesus Christ. In fact, if good people go to heaven, Jesus completely misled his audiences and, on at least one occasion, wrongly confronted a dying man. The truth is, Jesus taught the very opposite of what most people in the world believe. Jesus taught that good people don't go to heaven. Furthermore, he taught that God was intent on not giving people what they deserved. Jesus claimed that God desires to give men and women exactly what they do not deserve. I'm going to read that again. Jesus claimed that God desires to give men and women exactly what they do not deserve. Okay, I see. Not only was this a major departure from the religious teachings of his day, it was a departure from anything that had ever been taught anywhere at any time by anyone. The whole idea was so unsettling that Jewish religious leaders had the man arrested and crucified. After all, you can't have someone running around saying that God loves bad people and that bad people go to heaven. That might result in a moral free-for-all. Raising the ante. Jesus did a few other things that infuriated leaders of the religious establishment. For starters, he declared that even the best among them was not good enough to reach God on his own merit. For I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven. That was Matthew 5:20. When it came to keeping the law, the Pharisees were the best people around. Remember the complicated Old Testament laws we discussed earlier? The Pharisees actually tried to do all that stuff. It was their job. They were professional do-gooders. Their job was to stay so pure before God that they would be able to hear from him and thus direct the people accordingly. They took their job seriously. Not only did they keep the law that was given by Moses, they came up with even more rules to ensure that they didn't accidentally break one of Moses' rules. I'm not exaggerating when I say that these men spent the majority of their time making sure they were the best of the best. So you can imagine how irritated they were when Jesus pointed to several of them in public and announced that unless a person's goodness surpassed that of the finest men in town, that person wouldn't make it into God's kingdom. Basically, he pointed to the Pharisees and said, "As good as you aren't good enough." While the Pharisees walked away mad, everybody else probably walked away depressed. After all, if their religious leaders weren't good enough, then who could be? The average man and woman didn't have time to be that good. There were jobs to do, kids to raise, sheep to shear. If the Pharisees weren't good enough to earn their way into God's kingdom, then nobody was. Now let me take a quick time out from our story to ask you a question. If, according to Jesus, the guys who made a living out of being good weren't good enough for heaven, what about you? I've read that story at least a dozen times, and here's my conclusion. If Jesus was right, then I am definitely not good enough. I've broken almost all of the 10 Commandments many times, and I've never once sacrificed an animal for my sins. How about you? Can he do that? Another thing Jesus did that drove religious leaders nuts was tell people their sins were forgiven. Think about that. The only person who can forgive someone is the one who was offended or wronged. You wouldn't ask me to forgive you or something you did to your mother. You wouldn't ask your mother to forgive you. Okay, sorry, I'm going to read that again. You wouldn't ask me to forgive you for something you did to your mother. You would ask your mother to forgive you. Jesus told people their sins were forgiven when he wasn't even involved in the conflict. Makes no sense. If that wasn't confusing enough, he reinterpreted Jewish law in such a way as to make it impossible for anybody, even the Pharisees, to keep it. For example, during his most famous sermon, he said, You have heard that it was said, do not commit adultery. Everybody knew that one. It was one of the big 10. But Jesus wasn't content with the common interpretation. He raised the ante. You have heard that it was said, do not commit adultery. But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. That's from Matthew 5:27 through 28. Now that's not fair, and it's certainly not reasonable, and that's the standard, then, well, if that's the standard, then, we all stand guilty as charged, at least all the men. Jesus also said, "You have heard that it was said to the people long ago, 'Do not murder,' and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with his brother will be subject to judgment." That's in Matthew 5:21 through 22. Claiming to speak for God, Jesus equated anger with murder. Then, without batting an eye, he would turn to those who were considered the dregs of society and assure them that they had a place reserved for them in heaven. Go figure. My point? If you are looking for a God who lets good people into heaven, stay away from the New Testament. And by all means avoid the teachings of Jesus. His standards are even higher than those found in the Old Testament law. Besides, he seems to contradict himself. One minute, he assured bad people they had a place reserved in God's kingdom. Then he turned right around and assured the best people they didn't. If you think I've misinterpreted the teachings of Jesus, check it out for yourself. But first, allow me to fast forward to an incident that may bring clarity to much of what he said.